the School of Public Policy and Management of Tsinghua University, have the great honor to invite Professor Roberto Mangabeira Unger to give us a lecture. Judging by the huge audience in this hall, I think Professor Unger doesn't need introduction, but nevertheless I will give a brief introduction. Professor Unger is one of the leading legal, political, and social theorists of our time, and he is currently Pound Professor of Law of Harvard Law School, and but he's much more than a scholar. He has served twice in the government of Brazil as the Minister of Strategic Affairs, and his 7 of his books have been translated into Chinese already, and the latest Chinese translation of his book actually is titled Singular Universe and the Reality of the Time. This is a book co-authored with one of the leading cosmologists, Liz Molin. And judging by this latest title, you can imagine how wide the range of Professor Unger's imagination. And tonight, the topic of his lecture is Imagining Alternatives, Law, Economics, and the Political Thought after Mental Colonialism. And after Professor Unger's lecture, we will invite Professor Wang Hui, the Director of Institute of Advanced Studies at Tsinghua University, and Professor Feng Xiang, Professor of Law at Tsinghua Law School, to give their comments, and then we open for the general discussion. So now the floor is yours, Roberto.
There is a dictatorship of no alternatives in the world today. The ideas that prevail in the high academic culture around the world, across the whole field of social and historical studies, are on the whole complicit in the maintenance of this dictatorship. The overthrow of the dictatorship of no alternatives in the world requires, as one of its conditions, struggle against these dominant ideas in the high academic culture. That is my theme and my thesis. I begin by making some remarks about the character of the dictatorship of no alternative. There is now a very restricted set of live options available in the world for the organization of society in every part of social life. This restricted menu of alternative forms of social, economic, and political organization is the fate of the contemporary societies. To escape this fate, we must reshape the restricted repertory of institutional alternatives. And we must therefore have the ideas that allow us to enlarge it. In the rich North Atlantic countries today, there is a single dominant project of the governing elites. It can be described as a flexibilized social democracy. Its professed goal is to combine American-style economic flexibility with European-style social protection within a barely adjusted version of the inherited and established institutional arrangements for the economy and for the state. In the rest of the world, in the vast periphery of developing countries, one might expect to find a richer set of alternatives. No such set of alternatives has been presented. The main variation that we discover in the rest of the world, the main alternative to this liberalized or flexibilized social democracy is simply state capitalism, and often authoritarian state capitalism, sometimes maintained and defended under other labels, such as the label socialism. My contention is that this narrow range of alternatives, the fate of the contemporary societies, is incapable of solving or even of addressing the major problems of these countries. Let me give you a brief list of such problems. All of them require some form of resolution beyond the menu of options made available under the dictatorship of no alternatives. The first problem is the hierarchical segmentation of each national economy between advanced and backward sectors of production. There has now emerged in the world a new, most advanced practice of production. We might describe it as the knowledge economy. In principle, it is characterized by the transformation of productive activity into a practice of permanent innovation and radical experimentalism. It makes the best firms more closely resemble the best schools. It promises to relax and even to reverse what has hitherto been the most universal constraint in economic activity, the constraint of diminishing returns. It points to an approximation between the work of the imagination, of the mind in its imaginative side, and the activity of production. One of the corollaries of this mindful character of the knowledge economy is the potential radically to change the relation between the worker and the machine. Under the previous practices of production, such as industrial mass production, the worker worked as if he were a machine, in routinized moves like the moves of his rigid machines. Now the knowledge economy suggests to us a different idea. Everything that we have learned how to repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm, and everything that we can express formulaically, we embody in a mechanical device, the machine. The point of the machine is to do for us everything that we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. The worker can therefore become not a quasi-machine, but an anti-machine. And the combination of the machine and the anti-machine is incomparably more powerful than either of them alone. Under the new practice of production, there is the potential for a revolution in the moral culture of productive activity. The previous forms of production radically limited the discretion allowed to each worker and required only a modicum of trust, a generalized low trust among participants in the process of production. The knowledge economy demands a heightening of the level of trust and of discretion, and therefore a radical change in the moral culture of production. No longer just a generalized low trust, but a high or even higher trust. Now that is the untapped potential of the most advanced practice of production. Untapped, because the knowledge economy as it now exists in the world remains confined to insular vanguards that exclude in every country the vast majority of the labor force. The insularity of the new economic vanguardism, the arrest of the most productive practice to these insular vanguards is the fundamental cause of economic stagnation and of massive economic inequality in the major economies of the world. The best way, or even the only way, to ensure broad-based economic growth would be to radicalize and to disseminate the knowledge economy, to spread it throughout the whole of economic life. So long as the knowledge economy remains confined in the insular vanguards, there is a machine for the creation of massive inequality. The inequality generated by the abyss between the vanguards and the rearguards. The traditional devices for the moderation of inequality, the defense of small business against big business, and compensatory redistribution on the basis of progressive taxation and of redistributive social spending, are completely inadequate to redress the inequalities generated by this hierarchical segmentation of the economy. The only adequate response would be to reshape the institutional arrangements of economic life that influence the primary distribution of economic advantage, as opposed to trying to correct these inequalities after the fact through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. Now, such a project, the project of an inclusive vanguardism, defies the limits of the social democratic compromise, established in the middle of the 20th century in the richest economies of the world. The basis of the social democratic compromise was the abandonment of any attempt to reshape economic and political institutions. In exchange for that abandonment, the state was allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy more intensively, to attenuate inequalities by compensatory redistribution, and to manage the economy countercyclically through monetary and fiscal policy. Not enough. The only initiative that would be enough would be institutional change in the service of an inclusive vanguardism. The second problem, lying beyond the frontiers of the dictatorship of no alternatives, is the consignment of an increasing proportion of the labor force in every major economy of the world to precarious employment. Labor is now being reorganized on a global basis through decentralized contractual arrangements. No longer the assembly of a stable labor force in large productive units under the aegis of unified large corporations. And the result is then to condemn the majority of the workforce everywhere in the world to precarious employment and radical economic insecurity. The third problem that defies the capabilities of flexibilized social democracy, and more generally of the dictatorship of no alternatives, is the relation between finance and the real economy. Under the current arrangements, production is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. What is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? Theoretically, the purpose is to fund the productive agenda of society. In fact, under the present system, the vast preponderance of financial activity has only an oblique or episodic relation to the financing of production. Finance is therefore indifferent to the real economy in good times and destructive in bad times. Instead of being a good servant, it becomes a bad master. The fourth problem that goes beyond the limits of liberalized social democracy is the provision of an adequate basis for social solidarity, for social union, for social cohesion. Under institutionally conservative social democracy, the only basis for social solidarity is the organization of money transfers by the state through progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. Money is an inadequate social cement, and its inadequacy becomes manifest as the cultural and ethnic homogeneity of each country diminishes. The only adequate practical basis for social solidarity would be direct responsibility to take care of other people beyond the boundaries of one's own family. Civil society would have to be organized in such a way that every able-bodied adult would have both a position in the production system and the responsibility in the course of his working life to take care of others. The gift of time. The fifth problem that goes beyond the limits of liberalized social democracy is the organization of political life. All the democracies that exist in the world are weak democracies. All of them are organized in a fashion that continues to make change depend upon crisis. In all of these weak democracies, the rule is no trauma, no transformation. They perpetuate impasse, and they maintain popular political engagement in political life at a low level of mobilization. To innovate in the structure of society, we would need to create high-energy democracies. Quickening the pace of politics, the rapid resolution of impasse, and heightening the temperature of politics, the level of organized popular engagement in democratic politics. There is no solution to the fundamental problems of the contemporary societies without institutional innovation. Now, there are two main domains for institutional innovation today. The first domain is the reorganization of the market economy. The market economy has no single natural and necessary form. Economic decentralization can be organized in radically different ways, even on the basis of radically different regimes of contract and property. The attempt to promote an inclusive vanguardism, a broad-based form of the knowledge economy, would require radical institutional innovation in the institutions of the market. At the end of the day, the market economy would no longer be fastened to a single version of itself. Alternative regimes of property and of contract would coexist experimentally within the same market order. The second major domain of institutional innovation is the organization of political life, of democracy. We would require a democracy that shapes a decisive pluralism, a dialectic of alternative political and social forces, but that resolves impasse among these forces decisively and quickly, that combines strong central initiative with opportunities for radical devolution. In other words, as society goes down a certain path, it allows parts of the country to secede from the general solutions and to create countermodels of the national future. And in this high-energy democracy, we would organize political life cumulatively to increase the level of organized popular engagement in politics. The premise of conservative political science is that politics must be either institutional and cold, or hot and anti-institutional or extra-institutional. But what we need in this vision is a politics that is simultaneously institutional and hot. Now, in these initial remarks, I have simply tried to give some content to the idea of the dictatorship of no alternatives, and to suggest the significance of what the dictatorship of no alternatives excludes. In my talk today, in the remainder of my intervention, I proceed in the following steps. First, I describe the main tendencies in the high academic culture of social and historical study. In order to vindicate my claim that this academic culture is complicit in the maintenance of the dictatorship of no alternatives. Second, I outline the historical origin, the evolution of this situation. In the history of our ideas about structure and structural change. Third, I exemplify my account of the present situation of the high academic culture in the two most important disciplines of the institutional imagination, law and economics. Fourth, I enumerate the characteristics of the academic culture that we need to understand the contemporary societies and to imagine their transformation. And fifth, I suggest the main motivations that can support us in such an effort. Now, I must address each of these 5 parts of my argument in the most summary form. But I hope that the argument will not be so abbreviated that the message fails to be intelligible. Today, across the whole area of social and historical studies, in the North Atlantic world and in its outposts, there are 3 main tendencies. In the hard, positive social sciences, beginning with economics, what prevails is the rationalizing tendency. The established arrangements of the contemporary societies are explained in ways that make them seem natural or necessary or superior, as the result of a quasi-Darwinian evolution or convergence to the best possible practices and institutions. In the normative social disciplines of political philosophy and legal theory, what predominates is the humanizing tendency. The provision of pseudo-philosophical props to the ameliorative practices of institutionally conservative social democracy. For example, in the English-speaking world, the theories of justice, are really just quasi-metaphysical justifications under labels such as social contract of the wholly redistributive practices of conventional social democracy, with no structural content, with no suggestion of any need or any possibility of reshaping the institutional arrangements that define the economic order. The point is simply to humanize the economic order after the fact, through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. And in legal theory, to which I shall speak a little later in these comments, we find law represented as an idealized system of principles and policies. A system that makes the social democratic settlement of the last century seem to be not only coherent, but morally and politically compelling. And that discourages us in the effort to enlist the contradictions of established law in the creation of institutional alternatives. And in the humanities, what is ascendant is the escapist tendency. Subjectivity embarks on a roller coaster of adventurism, dissociated from the reimagination and remaking of society. The privatization of the sublime, a consequence of the fateful parting of the ways between leftism and modernism. The advocates of these three tendencies, the rationalizing, the humanizing, and the escapists, pretend to be enemies. In fact, they are allies. They are allies in the disarmament of the transformative will and of the transformative imagination. All of these tendencies prevailing in the high academic culture are expressions of what in the history of philosophy we would call right-wing Hegelianism. Their essential spirit is the idea of the rationality of the real, rather than its radical contingency and therefore its susceptibility to reimagination and remaking. Each of these tendencies breaks in its own way the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the possible. Not of the remote possible, but of the adjacent possible. To understand a phenomenon in every branch of thought is to grasp what it can become under certain provocations or interventions or circumstances. Not to understand its transformative possibilities is not to understand it at all. And that, on the whole, is what we find in this established academic culture. Mystification under the disguise of insight. Now I go on to the second step in my argument. The origins of this situation in the history of our thinking about structure. Let me begin with classical European social theory, as exemplified by its consummate expression, Karl Marx's theory of society and history. The revolutionary insight at the heart of these theories was the idea that the structure of society, its formative institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions, is not natural. It is an artifact. It is a kind of frozen fighting. It arises as the residue of the containment and interruption of practical and visionary strife over the terms of social life. We made it, as Vico said, and therefore we can understand it, as the Creator understands his creation. Now, this revolutionary insight into the artifact-like character of the structures of society was circumscribed and eviscerated in classical social theory by a series of deterministic assumptions. One of those assumptions was that there is in history a closed list of alternative regimes, such as Marx's modes of production. The second assumption was that each of these regimes is an indivisible system. It is either reproduced or it is replaced by another system. And therefore, there are only two kinds of politics. There is a reformist politics of the management of one of these systems, and there is a revolutionary politics of the substitution of one system for another. The third assumption is the assumption that there are laws of historical change governing the operation and the foreordained succession of these regimes in history. All of these assumptions are false. All of them have been discredited by historical learning and political experience. All of them have fateful, practical, political consequences that inhibit and disorient our efforts to transform society. What would be necessary is to rescue the revolutionary insight from the incubus of these deterministic illusions, and to continue the campaign that classical social theory began, the campaign of demystification. Now, that is not what has happened in the subsequent history of social thought and social science. What has happened is that the deterministic assumptions have been rejected only to the extent that the initial revolutionary insight has also been suppressed. The dominant spirit of these social sciences, the meaning of their practices, is to naturalize the established arrangements of society, to lend them a specious halo of naturalness, necessity, and authority. In all the ways that my earlier discussion of the rationalizing, humanizing, and escapist tendencies suggesting. Now, this suppression of insight into structural discontinuity and structural alternatives happens differently in each social science. As Tolstoy says at the beginning of Anna Karenina, all happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So each of the social sciences has its peculiar form of unhappiness, but each of these peculiar forms is in the service of the same suppression of structural insight. So now, in this third step of my argument, I exemplify the peculiar forms of unhappiness in the two disciplines that have the greatest practical importance for the transformation of society: law and economics. For a long time, the main activity of legal theory has been to criticize so-called formalism, the doctrinal conceptualism that is attributed to 19th century legal thought. And this formalism is systematically misrepresented. So it is misrepresented as the idea that law is a gapless system of rules and concepts from which we can infer by a quasi-deductive method of inference the single correct legal solution to every problem. In fact, what contemporary legal theory describes as formalism would be better described as the typological idea that in the 19th century, the rightists shared with the leftists. It was the idea that there is a limited list of regimes. One of them is the market order, or what Marx called capitalism, and that each regime has its inbuilt legal and institutional architecture, which it is the purpose of legal science to unpack or to reveal. That's what the 19th century legal formalism really was. And now, the prevailing ideas in legal thought propose to put in the place of this misrepresented legal formalism a systematic idealization of law in the vocabulary of impersonal policy and principle. It is in fact an idealization of the mid-20th century social democratic compromise with all of its consequences for the suppression of insight into structural alternatives. The systematic idealization of law as the embodiment of impersonal policies and principles imposes three unacceptable consequences. First, it is a mystification of law. That's not what law is like. Real law is always organized in every field as a combination of dominant solutions with a periphery of anomalies, of exceptions, of vestiges, of prophecies. And this contradictory material is the basis for the transformative imagination and the transformative will to go to work. The second cost is the cost of the usurpation of power. The jurist remakes the law under the pretext of reinterpreting it. In the name of this interpretation of law in the vocabulary of impersonal policy and principle, and usurps democratic power, the sovereignty of the people. And the third cost is the cost of inhibiting or paralyzing the indispensable dialectic between experimentation with the institutions of society and the reinterpretation of our ideals and interests. What is law? Law is the institutional form of the life of a people, represented in relation to the interests and the ideals that make sense of it. Our interests and ideals are always nailed to the cross of the institutions and practices that represent them in fact. And law is the site of this crucifixion. We therefore need a practice of legal analysis that transforms it into institutional imagination. Not in the form of the abstractions like capitalism or socialism that fascinated classical European social theory and the traditional ideological debates, but in the form of the small variations and contradictions in the established arrangements of society that can serve as points of departure for institutional innovation. Now consider the other example of the unhappiness, economics. The most powerful and influential social science. Since the 19th century, since the end of the 19th century, economics has not been the study of the economy. Economics has become the study of a method. The method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. The main line of economic theory is simply an extension of this method. The traditional criticisms of economics fail because they misrepresent the nature of this analytic practice. They criticize economics, for example, for making unrealistic assumptions about the operations of the economy or the psychology of economic agents. But economics, this economics, was never meant to be a description. The real failings of this main line of economic theory are in a completely different direction. There are four main defects. And to understand these defects is to begin to recognize the basis for a reorientation of economics today. The first defect is the radical separation in the economics inaugurated by marginalism between formal economic analysis and empirical discovery. You could say that in economics there is theory and there is empiricism, but they have almost nothing to do with each other. As the Austrian economists understood, this economics is not really a causal science at all. It is akin to logic. It is a form of quasi-logical inquiry, inferring the consequences of different premises. The model is a model of the maximization of goals under the constraints of scarcity. And the purer the method of economics is, the less it makes any factual, causal, or normative assumptions. It is a pure apparatus of logical analysis that works only on the basis of the factual, causal, or normative fuel that is supplied to it from the outside. The marginalists devised this method in the hope of producing an economic science that would be invulnerable to criticism, that would be neutral in causal and normative controversy. But the price of this purity is impotence. The result has been to condemn this pseudoscience to an eternal infancy by breaking the vital link between theory and empirical discovery. There is nothing that happens in the world that could impeach the legitimacy of this pure form of economic analysis. The economist simply produces another model without changing the underlying theory. It's like the comedian Groucho Marx said, "I have principles, and if you don't like them, I have other ones." The second defect of this tradition of economic theory is its deficit of institutional imagination. To this day, the economist continues to believe that a market is a market, contract is contract, and property is property. If economics is coherent in its purity, it would make no institutional assumptions whatsoever. But then it would be impotent to explain or to propose. To intervene in the practical debates of policy, the economist compromises this analytic purity and begins to identify the abstract idea of the market with the contingent set of economic institutions that evolved in modern Western history. Economics then is either pure and impotent or powerful and compromised. The third defect of this tradition of economic theory is that it has no account of production. In pre-marginalist economics, in the classical economics of Adam Smith or Karl Marx, there was an account of exchange and an account of production. And they were at an equal level. In this economics, there is really only an account of exchange. And the world of production is viewed as a shadowy extension of the system of exchange. The subordination of the theory of production to the theory of exchange is made possible by an important but contingent feature of these economies, namely that in them labor can be bought and sold. And therefore, production can be seen under the lens of relative prices. In the 19th century, until very late, it was the universal belief of liberals as well as of socialists that economically dependent wage labor was an inferior form of free work, retaining many of the characteristics of slavery or serfdom, and that it must give way to the two higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. It was only relatively recently that the predominance of wage labor was naturalized, and that naturalization then helped make possible the subordination of the view of production to the view of exchange. The fourth failing of this predominant economic theory is this. It is a theory of competitive selection bereft of any corresponding account of the diversification of the material from which competitive selection selects. Consider it by analogy to the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the life sciences. There is a theory of competitive selection, Darwinian natural evolution, and there is a theory of the creation of the diversity on which natural selection operates through genetic mutation or recombination. What we have in this economics is only half of the theory. Paul Samuelson said that the single most penetrating discovery of economics was the Ricardian doctrine of comparative advantage, and more generally, the theory of trade, of free trade. The premise of the theory of trade and of comparative advantage is the division of the world into different states. But from the standpoint of economics, the division of the world into different states or economies is an accident or an embarrassment with no proper economic significance. The world might just as well be a single economy. There is no theory of diversity. The combined and cumulative effect of these four defects that I have enumerated is radically to diminish the utility of the dominant economics as a device for the understanding of economic transformation. It is a powerful tool for the understanding of trade-offs and of constraints, but it has very little power to contribute to our transformative insight. I now come to the fourth step of my argument. In the light of this polemic that I have outlined, what should we desire from the high academic culture across the whole field of social and historical study? It should have the following characteristics. First, its primary fundamental subject matter should be the explanation of established structure and the insight into structural discontinuity and structural alternatives in history. In every historical circumstance, there is a framework of formative institutional arrangements and ideological assumptions. That framework is the supreme target of theoretical ambition and of transformative practice. But we cannot understand it as a system. It is not a system. It is a ramshackle construction. It does not change all at once. It changes in pieces, in parts, Structural change is almost always fragmentary.